All right, let's dive into some perspectives on Thailand's economic landscape today. We're going to be focusing on two pretty prominent figures, Thaksin Shinawatra, former prime minister, and Sethaput Suthiwart-Narueput, the current governor of the Bank of Thailand.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare their ideas. We've got Thaksin's recent remarks from the Forbes Global CEO Conference, and then we'll look at a 1999 report Sethaput wrote about public debt and the Asian financial crisis.
Okay, so right away, Thaksin makes this big claim. He says that Thailand's economy, well, it could have grown way more in the last decade if the Bank of Thailand hadn't been so cautious, basically. He actually said they should be more in tune with what businesses need. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Thaksin is known for being pretty proactive, maybe even a bit more risk-taking when it comes to economic stuff. He really criticized the central bank's control over how commercial banks lend money. He thinks it choked the flow of cash and slowed down the economy.
Interesting. And then there's that idea he floated about a shadow committee, like a group to keep an eye on what the central bank is doing. Some people might see that as a power play by the business world, right?
Yeah, for sure. It definitely raises some questions about who has the power. Should it be the government institutions or the private sector? Where do we draw the line between, careful regulation and creating an environment where businesses can actually grow and innovate?
Exactly. And it seems like that's a core part of Thaksin's whole message. He's really pushing Thai businesses to adapt to how the world is changing, to be more innovative, especially with competition from platforms like, did you see this, China's Temu?
Yeah, he mentioned that specifically. He definitely sees technology and innovation as the keys to growth in the future. And he thinks attracting foreign investment is a big part of that.
And he has a plan for that, doesn't he? Reduce corporate tax, increase VAT, and offer some pretty sweet tax incentives. It seems kind of counterintuitive, though, doesn't it? Like raising taxes while trying to attract investors.
Yeah, but he's thinking that lower corporate tax will bring more businesses to Thailand, and the higher VAT would make up for the lost revenue from those tax cuts. It's a gamble for sure, but he's betting on that economic activity to make up for it.
A gamble indeed. And I was intrigued by his take on the whole U.S.-China trade war thing. Most people see it as a threat, but he's kind of optimistic about it, right?
Yeah, he thinks it's an opportunity for Thailand. As manufacturers try to, move their production away from China, Thailand could be a stable and attractive alternative, especially with those tax breaks and all.
Makes sense. It's like turning a crisis into a strategic win. And he's not stopping there. His vision is to turn Thailand into a whole regional tech hub, using its culture and tourism, that soft power, to its advantage. A 10-year plan with focus on the creative economy, digital infrastructure, data centers, AI, the whole 9 yards.
Ambitious, for sure. But now let's flip the script and look at Sethaput's report. It's a completely different vibe, taking us back to the Asian financial crisis. And it's a much more cautious analysis of what public debt can actually do.
All right, so this was written in 1999, right in the middle of it all. What was the main question he was trying to answer?
Well, the big question was, did Thailand taking on more debt during the crisis, did it lead to what's called crowding out? Basically, did the government borrowing money make it harder for private businesses to borrow and invest?
So like the government is gobbling up all the available credit,
Ouch.
and that squeezes out the private sector, right?
Exactly.
So what did Sethaput find?
His analysis actually showed that despite the fact that public debt did increase a lot, there wasn't really much evidence of crowding out, which is pretty interesting because a lot of people think public debt automatically has negative effects.
That is surprising. Why do you think that happened? Was it just a fluke, or were there other reasons?
There were a few factors at play. First, the economic contraction during the crisis itself actually reduced the private sector's need for credit. Businesses weren't really in a position to borrow and invest with all that uncertainty going on.
So because demand for credit was lower, the government borrowing didn't drive up interest rates too much.
Exactly. And then there's the Bank of Thailand's monetary policy. They worked to keep interest rates at a level that wouldn't scare away private investors, even with the government borrowing more.
That sounds like they were walking a tightrope.
Yeah, for sure. They had to support the economy without making things worse. But here's the most important thing. Sethaput found that a lot of the debt was actually used to help financial institutions that were struggling. It wasn't just for government programs or projects. It was about stabilizing the whole financial sector, which actually helped private businesses in the long run.
So it was kind of like using debt to prevent a bigger financial meltdown.
Right.
And that indirectly helped the private sector by keeping the whole system from collapsing.
Exactly. It shows that not all debt is bad. It's about what the debt is used for and how it's managed.
Really interesting point. So looking back at that, did Sethaput have any thoughts about how Thailand should handle its finances going forward? Was he all optimistic, or were there some warning signs too?
He was definitely cautious. While debt was manageable during the crisis, the long-term effects are always harder to predict. He pointed out a few things that could lead to crowding out later on.
Like what?
Well, one thing is that Thailand needs to keep investing in infrastructure, education, all that, to keep growing and stay competitive, but that often means more government borrowing. And that could start pushing interest rates up and crowd out private investment if it's not done carefully.
So it's a balancing act, right? You need investment to grow, but too much debt can be a problem.
Exactly. Plus, there are other things adding to the budget pressure, like the new constitution and the tariff reforms. Both of those require more government spending, which could mean even more borrowing.
A lot of moving parts to keep track of. It's not just about debt by itself, but how it interacts with everything else.
Absolutely. And on top of that, there's the possibility that the government might have to absorb more losses from the Financial Institutions Development Fund. That's the FIDF, the one that bails out troubled financial institutions.
Right, the FIDF. Okay. So if they have to bail out more institutions, those losses could end up being the government's problem.
Yeah, adding to the debt.
Wow. So we've got Thaksin, who's all about bold moves and rapid growth. And then we've got Sethaput, whose analysis is much more cautious, focusing on careful financial management. Two pretty different approaches to how we think about economic growth.
Definitely. It makes you wonder which path is more likely to lead to sustainable growth for Thailand.
That's a great question. And it's something to think about as we continue our deep dives. We'll explore more specifics from both Thaksin and Sethaput's views in our next segment. Stay tuned.
Speaking of risk and reward, I think it's worth looking closer at some of the specific ideas Thaksin laid out for attracting foreign investment. He really seems to have a clear vision for how he wants to transform Thailand into a global business hub.
Yeah, definitely. And some of those proposals are pretty interesting, to say the least, like his idea of completely restructuring the tax system, lowering the corporate tax rate while also increasing VAT. It sounds a little counterintuitive at first, don't you think?
It does on the surface, but there's a logic behind it. He thinks that a lower corporate tax rate will make Thailand more appealing to businesses that are looking for a tax-friendly place to set up shop. And then the increase in VAT, which is a consumption tax, would help balance out the revenue loss from those corporate tax cuts.
So it's like a calculated gamble, hoping that the increased economic activity and consumer spending will make up for the initial drop in government revenue. It's fascinating how these economic levers can be tweaked to try and steer things in a certain direction. But it's not just about attracting big corporations, right? It seems like he's also really passionate about supporting small businesses and local entrepreneurs, especially in areas like tourism, culture, and creative industries.
Absolutely. He sees those sectors as vital for Thailand's future, using the country's unique cultural heritage and natural beauty to drive sustainable growth. It's a smart strategy, really, building on existing strengths.
Yeah, playing to your strengths. And he's not shying away from the need to upgrade Thailand's infrastructure either. To attract those tech companies, he's so keen on luring in, talking about developing data centers, smart grids, promoting clean energy, creating that modern tech-savvy environment that would appeal to the Silicon Valley giants.
Exactly. He knows the world is shifting towards digital economies, and he wants Thailand to be leading the charge, not lagging behind. But what I found really interesting was his perspective on the potential U.S.-China trade war. Most people see it as a threat, but he almost seemed optimistic about it.
Yeah, he did, didn't he? It's almost like he saw it as an opportunity in disguise, which is a bold take, given the uncertainty and potential economic fallout that a trade war could bring.
His thinking was that Thailand could actually benefit from the trade tensions. As companies start looking to move their manufacturing out of China, Thailand could position itself as a stable and attractive alternative. With those tax incentives and streamlined regulations, it could attract a wave of new foreign investment.
It's like turning a potential crisis into a strategic win. And he didn't stop there. He also made some thought-provoking comments about BRICS, that group of emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. He suggested that their increasing influence could lead to a new international payment system. One that's independent of the U.S. dollar. That's a pretty bold prediction, wouldn't you say?
It is, and it really speaks to how the global financial system is evolving. As these emerging economies gain more economic power, they're naturally going to want more autonomy and influence in international finance. It's something to watch closely, especially if you're interested in geopolitics and how the world order is changing.
For sure. And he wasn't just focused on the global picture. He also had some pointed critiques of existing international institutions like ASEAN and APEC.
Oh yeah, he didn't hold back there. He argued that they need to be more effective at promoting cooperation and supporting smaller economies. Less talk, more action, basically. He called for clearer strategies, more tangible outcomes from their meetings, and less bureaucratic inertia.
It's a pretty common criticism of those large multilateral organizations, but it's interesting to hear it from someone like Thaksin, someone who's been so involved in international diplomacy and economic policy.
Right. It shows he's not afraid to call out what he sees as shortcomings, even within established institutions.
There's definitely a sense of urgency in his message. Like he feels these organizations need to adapt to the realities of the global economy if they want to stay relevant and effective.
Yeah, he's calling for real change, not just lip service.
Right. So to sum it up, Thaksin's vision for Thailand's economic future is one of bold transformation, embracing technology, attracting foreign investment, and leveraging its cultural and tourism assets to become a regional powerhouse. It's a vision that's ambitious and pragmatic at the same time, recognizing both the challenges and the opportunities that Thailand faces in a world that's changing faster than ever. But let's circle back to Sethaput's report and his analysis of public debt. That 1999 research paper, focusing on the Asian financial crisis, really provides valuable historical context for understanding where Thailand stands today.
Absolutely. While Thaksin's looking ahead, Sethaput's work reminds us that decisions made in the past can have long-lasting consequences. It's important to understand the lessons learned from previous crises to avoid repeating mistakes.
And one of the key questions he addressed was whether the increased public debt Thailand took on during the Asian financial crisis actually had a crowding out effect on private investment. Can you remind us what crowding out means in this context?
Sure. Crowding out happens when government borrowing pushes up interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to borrow money and invest. Essentially, the government's demand for credit can squeeze out the private sector, which can slow down economic growth.
Right. So it's not about avoiding debt altogether. It's about managing it responsibly. And what did Sethaput's research reveal about the impact of public debt during the Asian financial crisis? Did he find evidence of this crowding out effect?
It's interesting because his analysis actually showed that even though public debt did increase significantly during the crisis, there wasn't much evidence of crowding out, which kind of challenges the conventional wisdom that high levels of public debt always stifle private investment. It suggests that other factors like the overall economic climate and the specific policies implemented by the government and the central bank can play a big role in mitigating the potential negative impacts of public debt.
So it's more nuanced than just saying debt is bad. What were some of the specific reasons he identified that contributed to this positive outcome? Why didn't crowding out happen during the crisis, even with all that debt?
Well, there were a few key factors. First, the economic contraction that came with the crisis actually led to a drop in demand for credit from the private sector. Businesses were less likely to borrow and invest during such uncertain times, which naturally eased the pressure on interest rates.
So the crisis itself actually helped prevent crowding out because businesses weren't borrowing as much anyway.
Exactly. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it highlights how economic crises can create unexpected and complex dynamics.
Definitely. It's a reminder that economics is rarely straightforward. Were there any other contributing factors that he pointed out?
Another crucial factor was the Bank of Thailand's monetary policy. They took steps to make sure interest rates stayed at a level that wouldn't discourage private investment, even while the government was increasing its borrowing. It was a delicate balancing act.
So it wasn't just about the amount of debt. It was also about how that debt was managed and how the central bank responded to the government's borrowing.
Exactly. But maybe the most important factor, the one that really sets this crisis apart, is that a big chunk of the public debt incurred during the Asian financial crisis was actually used to help struggling financial institutions. Instead of directly funding government programs or projects, the debt was used to stabilize the whole financial sector, which indirectly helped private businesses by preventing a wider financial meltdown.
So in a way, the government was using debt to prevent a bigger economic catastrophe. And by doing that, they actually helped the private sector in the long run.
Precisely. It shows that the purpose and the management of debt matter a lot. Not all debt is created equal, and in this case, the government's borrowing actually helped to avoid a more severe economic downturn.
That's a really important point. It challenges the idea that all government debt is inherently bad. Sometimes it can be a necessary tool for stabilizing the economy and preventing things from getting worse.
Absolutely. But like any tool, it needs to be used carefully and strategically.
So even though things turned out relatively well during the crisis, did Sethaput express any concerns about the future? Was he totally optimistic about Thailand's ability to manage its public debt going forward?
Well, he did voice some caution. He acknowledged that while the immediate impact of increased public debt during the crisis was manageable, the long-term consequences were harder to predict. He pointed to a few factors that could potentially lead to crowding out down the line.
Oh, what were some of the risks he flagged?
One key concern was the need for continued capital investment to fuel economic growth. To stay competitive and meet the needs of a growing population, Thailand needs to invest in infrastructure, education, research and development, all of that. And a lot of that investment will probably come from government borrowing, which, if not managed carefully, could push up interest rates and eventually crowd out private investment.
It's a tough balancing act, isn't it? You need investment to grow, but that same investment can cause problems if it leads to too much debt and higher interest rates.
Exactly. And it becomes even more complicated with other budgetary pressures that Thailand's facing, like the costs associated with the new constitution and the ongoing tariff reforms. These initiatives, while important, require more government spending, which could lead to even more borrowing.
So it's not just about managing debt in a vacuum. It's about managing debt within the context of all these other competing priorities and demands on government resources.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of the Financial Institutions Development Fund, the FIDF. Remember, that's the entity that bails out troubled financial institutions during crises.
Right, the financial safety net.
Yeah.
So if the FIDS has to step in again and rescue more institutions, those losses could end up on the government's balance sheet, right, adding to the public debt burden.
Exactly. It's a potential liability that policymakers need to keep in mind when they're making decisions about spending and borrowing.
It's a complex situation with a lot of interconnected factors to consider. We've got Thaksin, the former prime minister, pushing for bold action and a more proactive approach to managing the economy, focused on attracting foreign investment and driving growth. And then we have Sethaput, the current governor of the Bank of Thailand, urging more caution and prudence when it comes to public finances, emphasizing the potential risks of excessive debt and the need to carefully manage government spending.
It's a fascinating contrast, two very different perspectives on the best way to achieve sustainable economic growth for Thailand.
And it raises some really important questions that apply not just to Thailand, but to economies all over the world. How do we balance the desire for growth with the need for fiscal responsibility? What are the long-term impacts of the policy choices we make today? And how do we navigate a global economic landscape that's increasingly complex and unpredictable?
These are big questions, and there aren't any easy answers.
That brings us to the heart of the matter. Given all the global uncertainties, Thailand's internal challenges, and these two contrasting perspectives on economic management,
the question becomes, which approach is more likely to lead Thailand toward a future of prosperity and stability?
it's something to really think about as we move into our final segment, where we'll explore the potential paths ahead for Thailand's economy and delve into the challenges and opportunities that lie along the way. Don't go anywhere.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into Thailand's economic outlook, one thing's for sure, there are a lot of different opinions on the best way forward.
Yeah, no shortage of ideas floating around.
We've got Thaksin Shinawatra pushing for bold action, a more hands-on approach. And then you've got Sethaput Suthiwart-Narueput advocating for a more measured, cautious strategy.
Two very different approaches.
It really makes you think, which path is more likely to lead to sustainable growth and prosperity for Thailand?
Especially with all the global uncertainty right now.
Yeah, there's no easy answer, is there? No magic formula.
Not at all. It's probably going to be a mix of strategies, something tailored to Thailand's specific situation. Thaksin's vision is definitely appealing. Attracting foreign investment, becoming a tech hub, using Thailand's location and culture to its advantage. It's a pretty compelling picture he paints.
It is, but Sethaput's analysis reminds us that those big moves come with risks too, especially when you're talking about managing public debt and keeping things stable in the long run.
It's a balancing act, that's for sure. High stakes too.
Absolutely.
If Thailand wants to really thrive, it has to find that balance between ambition and, Well, a little bit of caution.
I think you're right.
One thing that really stood out to me was how much emphasis was put on human capital. Thaksin talked about Thai businesses needing to adapt and innovate, to really embrace technology and develop the right skills to compete globally.
Yeah, he was really pushing for that.
But it's bigger than just businesses, isn't it? It's about investing in people, in education and training, making sure everyone has opportunities.
You can't just focus on policies and infrastructure. You need a skilled and adaptable workforce to really reach your full potential.
It's not just about economic output either. Investing in people, in education and skills, it creates a more equitable society. It gives everyone a chance to contribute and share in the benefits.
Absolutely.
And that's where the government plays a key role.
Definitely.
Creating a supportive environment for businesses is important, but making sure everyone has access to quality education, healthcare, all those essential services, that's crucial too.
It's about creating a society that's both dynamic and inclusive,
where everyone has a chance to succeed.
That's the kind of foundation that will help Thailand navigate the rough waters ahead.
And ultimately build a truly prosperous future.
It's a long game for sure. It takes commitment from everyone, the government, businesses, civil society.
But the potential payoff is huge. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, I'm feeling a mix of optimism and, well, maybe a little bit of caution. Thailand faces some serious challenges, managing its debt, adapting to this rapidly changing global landscape.
There's a lot to contend with.
But Thailand also has so much going for it. A rich culture, a strategic location, and resilient people.
Definitely a lot of strengths to work with.
The decisions made today will have a big impact on Thailand's future.
Yeah, it's a pivotal moment.
It'll be interesting to see what happens.
For sure.
Well, that's it for this deep dive. But we'll be back with more, exploring these complex issues and hopefully shedding some light on them. Until next time, stay curious, and thanks for joining us.